My name is Daniela Campins. I am an artist. I focus on drawing and painting. I live in Los Angeles, and I work with abstract painting as well as with painting that uses text.
So, how did you come upon becoming an artist? Was there something that inspired you originally?
A lot of it had to do since, many of us begin, like when you're a child, you begin drawing and you become really infatuated with the fact that, hey, I was able to draw something really nice. And then you get like positive feedback and then gravitated towards the arts and crafts always. I was very much interested in architecture also when I was growing up, and buildings and drawing plans, like architectural plans. And I studied a little bit of architecture. And so I was always really into like making things using my hands. My grandparent was a supporter of the arts in my city in Venezuela, where I grew up. And I grew up surrounded by seeing paintings. And also my parents had three artist friends that were very successful. So I grew up seeing the possibilities of being a painter. But it wasn't until I moved to the United States in the mid 90s that I started to consider art as a career.
Was there something that inspired you in America to start pursuing art more?
Yeah, I always knew that I wanted to be like take the creative route, but I was at first more inclined towards studying like civil engineer, which was my career in Venezuela. And then when I came here, I couldn't do that for some, because I was an immigrant and there were some logistical issues that didn't allow me to do that. So I started to take some architectural drafting courses. I realized soon enough that what I like was drawing. What I like was drawing the plans. What I like was doing the mapping and everything, and the placement of things and the lines and the materials and the rulers and the T-squares. And I didn't want to think about the fire codes. I didn't want to think about like the materials of construction or any of that stuff. So that was just like a rude awakening. Like what I actually like is drawing. I just like making these drawings, working on paper. So I started to take some art classes and some illustration classes. And I was able to transfer to Cal State Long Beach to study illustration. And soon enough, I took a painting class with a professor there. Her name is Mary Thibault. And as soon as I took this class and I was able to paint, liquid paint and move my body and just like be able to make really large things, I realized that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life.
That's like a nice journey, being able to see that you really enjoy one part of your work and then being able to make that a career. How did you start moving into sort of developing your own style then, from architecture, which is probably very, straight edge and I'm sure some perspective, but you have a much more fluid style, at least now?
Yeah, I did go through most of my undergrad education and the beginning of my graduate education. I was still really focused on the idea of the grid. As a matter of fact, I was actually painting a lot of the shanty towns on the hillside from Venezuela, and I will use that as a starting point, and I will abstract it after that, and I will make it a little more disorganized and off kilter and unstable, because historically the architecture is makeshift, is very temporary, and it's unstable. So I was using the reference images from the hillside, but then thinking about metaphorically how unstable they are, and then just painting them in a more unstable way. And then as time passed by, the work started to get a little more loose. Mm-hmm. And I became really fascinated with the idea of line and just how simple is a line and how a line can actually activate a space. So I was very concerned with very simple pictorial elements, just very simple relationships between a mark on a field or a mark on something that's atmospheric as a background. So the work got more reductive and simplified with time.
So some of your work was inspired by Venezuela, and then some of your other work where you take lines from Venezuelan soap operas and paint those out as well. What is it sort of about, say, the soap operas or the culture of Venezuela that you're pulling out into your art?
It's been really interesting because this I feel like I'm working in two different bodies of work at the same time. I have the work that is very simplified, just me exploring the line and the scribbles and the doodling. And as soon as I started to do the doodling and the marks, it started to look like words to me, like symbols. Mm-hmm. And then they became actual real words and sentences. And I was just writing things on paper and just looking at them as compositions rather than what they actually meant at the beginning. And then at the same time, I was becoming very nostalgic because there was a lot of political instability. Well, there still is in my country. So I started to become very nostalgic, and I felt like I needed to make work or look for something back in time that came from Venezuela. And because I was feeling a little bit uncomfortable with making work that didn't have another layer of information just for the time being, because of everything that was going on back home. So I've decided to start to research soap operas from Venezuela, because it is a huge part of our culture and it's part of the fabric of who we are. We actually exported soap operas to the whole world for many, many years. And I particularly found a soap opera that is super interesting from 1978. It was filmed in 1978, but it's about the 1950s when we had a military dictatorship. I started to look into the dialogue and find as much footage as I could find online and save the footage. And I actually ended up using the footage for some paintings, and then I continued and evolved, and I just basically became sort of like, I'm just basically digging sentences as well as the dialogue in between certain characters, the protagonists especially, mm-hmm. and I deconstruct them or break them down, and then I turn them into text paintings.
Would you say that there's kind of a theme among some of the quotes that you pull out or the conversations that are going on?
Yeah, primarily there usually when there's some sort of level of anxiety, whether it's politically, because what happens in the 50s with this dictator was that they had a really strong police force, and a lot of people either disappeared or went to the secret police service and nobody knew where they were. So they kidnapped a lot of people and kept a lot of people in jail for a long time. And so it's usually from those scenes when people are being tortured or incarcerated. And it's also about the relationships between female characters and male characters, where there's a certain power dynamic, because those two things really inform kind of like how we are today in Venezuela.
So would you say, even though this was a soap opera from the 70s talking about the 50s, what would you say is sort of the aim of your work today and the commentary that it's making now?
I don't know if there could be necessarily a direct commentary, because they're not really on your face, but open conversations with people, and then I can tell them where it comes from. So it becomes more like we do have a conversation about this and the history and how words, and the relationships on how people talk to one another, characters like female and male characters, and how that constructs who we are as a society. But it's a very indirect and it's a very subtle way. It's not really you won't know firsthand. You have to kind of like have a little bit of background information. I don't know if I see the work as being about this political circumstance. I see that circumstance as part of the research that helps me to create the work, if that makes any sense at all.
So you're almost creating something new out of this entirely huge societal climate in a different time, and then sharing it in kind of an abstract way.
I think so. And I do think a lot about like the surface of the painting and how that's a metaphor for time and aging and layers and things that are run down and that are aged. So I do think about that in a way that thinking about the past, because I actually cut on my paintings and I carve and I cover and I erase and I also sand. So there's a process of layering and removal and going back in time and to the past and present. So I think I am deeply connected to the fact that the text comes from something very specific from the past.
Could you maybe describe sort of what that inspiration is of creating that sense of time and movement?
It's part of this way of working where you just work the painting and that you're really thinking about pictorial space, and then you're working and you're going layer after layer after layer, and you're really paying attention on how the mark creates some sort of like foreground and background relationship, and that foreground and background relationship and that building up of pictorial space to me has a relationship with time. And that's sort of like how I see that as necessary to have that layer, that level of layering or that progression of materiality onto the work.
If you're creating this work too with a very continual process almost, um, how do you start to decide, okay, this piece feels complete?
I can work on a painting forever. Like I would never stop, but I do choose to stop at some point when it feels compositionally sound.
Mm.
And I also like a little bit of tension, and I also like a little bit of not traditional balance, maybe like a little bit more awkwardness in the work. I usually have to wait a couple days to understand the work and to really see if it's really resolved. So maybe not finished, but I say maybe resolved will be like a way that I would think about it. Is this resolved? Am I interested in what I'm seeing? Does it feel like I did something different from what I did before?
And a lot of artists, I think, don't even feel like it reaches completeness. So I really like that description of feeling resolved. If somebody were to come to one of your shows and it was their first ever art show, how would you describe to them what you're doing?
Yeah, that's extremely difficult to define, like what the work means or what the body of work means. I just think in terms of I'm a painter, I'm trying to explore what this material can do for me, in regards to self-expression. I think I would say that I'm more interested in the process of what paint can do and how we can develop a personal language.
So you're also a speaker and teacher. What are some of the lessons that you teach to students?
It's for them to be patient with themselves. So all the technical stuff, yeah, you teach it, but I think there's something about developing an ethic of working, like, and then slowing down and knowing that making art takes time, and then being comfortable with that. It's important. And with being comfortable and being patient with themselves means that when they make something and it doesn't turn out the way that they think it doesn't turn out, it's okay. I think that knowing that you will fail and being okay with failure and accepting it as more of a learning aspect of your process, it's okay, because I've done many paintings that I think they're total failures, but I learned to know that I'm gonna have bad days or bad weeks.
What direction do you hope to continue with your future work?
I'm gonna always be a painter, and I think this way of working, I'm really happy with the research that I'm doing, and I want to continue to make more work based on the research from this particular soap opera. I'm drafting a plan to perhaps trying to find some of the writers from the soap opera so that I can actually interview them and ask them some questions about like what they were thinking. The main writer actually died a few years ago, so
Mm.
I found out by researching. His inspiration for the soap opera was that he actually was incarcerated for over 6 months by the secret police service during the dictatorship in the 50s.
Mhm.
So he drew inspiration from being incarcerated to actually write the soap opera. But unfortunately, he's passed. But there were other writers and other producers. So I want to get a grant so that I can produce something by interviewing them and maybe creating a sort of book related to the interviews mixed with my paintings in it. I'm not sure, it's just an idea, but
Yeah, that would be great. Where else can people find out more about you? Is there, website, social media?
Yeah, I do have a website. It's just danielacampins.com. And my Instagram is Daniela Campins Studio. And yeah, those are the two places where you can see my work.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time for this.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation. It was awesome.